Hello and welcome to the Monday, April 8th edition of the Cluster API provider AWS office hours. We have a relatively light agenda today, so if you do have any topics that you want to bring up, please go ahead and add them to the agenda. And also, if you are here attending live, please go ahead and add your name to the attending list on the notes as well. I've linked that in the group chat. So first item on the agenda, since this is the first time we're meeting since the V1 Alpha 1 release of Cluster API has been cut, we have a PSA that the V1 Alpha 1 version of the AWS provider has also been released. It's the 0.2.0 release on GitHub, and shortly after we released it, we had a few issues come in. So we will have 0.2.1 release here soon. And the one issue that I am aware of that we probably want to get in is one of the issues that are related to the PRs that are actually being brought up later in the agenda. So with that, let me go ahead and toss it over to Seth to talk about the tagging security groups and cloud providers.
Thanks. We ran into some issues with the load balancer integration built into the sort of core Kubernetes repo. We noticed that the cluster API, well, first it was crashing on trying to read the rules that the cloud integration had written to the security group. And that's what 697 fixes, is that it doesn't crash and it's able to manage those rules, but then it became clear pretty rapidly that the way it wanted to manage them was delete them because they weren't part of the spec for that security group. And so Nadir was kind enough to file issue 704 there about how, like, what the right way to share resources between Cluster API and the in-tree cloud provider. I don't actually have a very good way to refer to those two things separately because they're both cloud providers, right? But that's so that's what I have a PR sort of speculatively to fix that by creating a load balancer group that's separate from the other security groups, and then moving some of the tagging around so that we basically don't end up having both things trying to manage the same resource. But I definitely wanted to bring up for discussion what the right approach is for those sort of questions.
Yeah, so I can speak to kind of the motivation that we had originally on why we chose to do the common tagging with the cloud provider. It seemed like it was a common kind of pattern for systems that were kind of managing Kubernetes. I know COPS for sure tags things in a similar way. And I was actually hoping that Justin would be on today, and it doesn't look like he is. And I'm not sure if COPS has had similar issues with this, or if they've just not kind of managed either the security groups or the ELBs in the way that we are and haven't come across the same issue.
I mean, COPS is not an active management component. Is that true? Or is it, is there something that would be watching the security group and making changes to it as its state changes?
Yeah, I think it would just happen if you came through and you ran another command with COPS. So it's not necessarily an active management like we are doing with Cluster API, but it is meant to kind of reconcile the intended state in a similar way. So it may only be some that they would hit if they were running like a reconfigure operation or like an upgrade versus us hitting it periodically as part of the resync.
Yeah, so I forget what the number, the PR that I put together as like a proof of concept for 704 there was, it uses two tags, one for the these are the resources managed by Kappa, and then it separates out the Kubernetes IO/cluster thing, and that's the handoff mechanism for I I give to you in Tree Cloud Provider these resources, and I promise I won't look at them, is sort of the thought that I've had. It seemed to work okay when I tried it, but you know, take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes a lot of sense. I'll definitely, last week I was mostly tied up with the goals and requirements and use cases documents, so I didn't have a chance to take a look last week, but I'll dig into the proposal here and the issue more this afternoon and reply back with any comments that I have there. Otherwise, the general idea of using separate distinct tags seems perfectly fine with me.
Cool. The other sort of knock-on piece of that I'd appreciate taking a look at is the managed tag that's in there. It's like a managed true is sort of redundant with the separate tag that I introduced for like Kappa owns this thing, but I'm not 100% sure. So if you could take a look like with an eye to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. The only reason why we really added that before was specifically for being able to differentiate specific things that we spun up as part of Cluster API versus things that were potentially spun up, from the integrated cloud provider. So if we're using distinct tags, then the managed tag would definitely be obsolete.
Cool.
So my question around this was, if both providers make use of if the cloud provider only makes use of the cluster name tag, then there's always a risk that it will, as its functionality increases, that it starts modifying resources that we are also spinning up. Do we need a long-term solution to this? And what would it look like?
Well, I think if we use distinct tagging for the managed resources, then I don't see there being potential future conflict.
So the tag that it looks for is just the kubernetes.io cluster / name of cluster equals owned. So as far as the provider goes, that's the only one it cares about. And we also use that for reconciliation.
Right. But if we no longer use that and use a distinct tag for Cluster API, then that should no longer be an issue.
That is true. It's probably the easiest thing to do on our end. Otherwise, it would mean changing the cloud provider.
And that's PR 706 is sort of the whip that I have that tries to do that and introduce that separate tag. So if you take a look at that, I'd definitely appreciate the feedback.
Cool.
We don't have anybody on the call that's more familiar with COPS to speak to any potential, questions or concerns from their side. Yeah.
I can try to follow up with Justin on some other time to make sure he sees the thing.
Yeah, that'd be great. I just want to make sure that, that one, if there's a legitimate reason why they're using the same tag and why they're not hitting issues versus the reason why we're hitting issues. And then the other one being is if we are hitting these issues and it's something that they might likely hit in the future, then we definitely want to make them aware of it as well. All right. Anything else on that topic before moving on? All right, then on to how to progress with clashing PRs.
Thanks. Yes, so As Seth just mentioned about while working on 704, there's been issue uh, about nil pointer dereference in the controller codes, and it seems that 697 fixes that. And while I was working on 701, I found the same issue, and basically I fixed that as well within my PR. And we should probably decide what to do in this case. I personally think we should just merge 697 first, and then this will simplify 701. And yeah, that would be probably the way to go if it comes to me.
I'm happy to have you rebase. That sounds fun.
Yeah, I think that since there's like specific PR that fixes this exact thing, I think it makes sense to merge it. Otherwise, I would need to split mine, and it's not worth it. Basically, that's my point.
Yeah, I think that sounds good to me. Definitely in favor of more targeted fixes versus kind of pulling in a fix through another change set if at all possible. So I will definitely go ahead and take a look at both of those PRs today, and that ordering looks good to me.
Cool, thank you.
And then, well, the next item, still with you, Dominic, HA control plane.
Yes, so I work on extending the cluster AWS ADM command. So I introduced additional create HA cluster subcommand there. And basically the status of that is that it seems to work. And I'm able to create 3 control plane nodes cluster for me. Then I pivot them from kind cluster, and then eventually I'm able to get a node, single worker node for now, running and joining the cluster, because I hit some issues like networking issues and on AWS that stopped me from progressing on that, because I wanted to sort out this first to make sure when PR is ready for review, it will actually work when someone tries to run it. So once 697 and 701 are merged, I should be pretty much done. I still need to tidy up some things around the PR, but the majority of work is done basically right now. So.
All right. So one thing, and I wasn't predicting this kind of coming in as quickly as it did when I initially proposed the subcommand under cluster AWS ADM. We did have a PR recently to upstream cluster API to add support for deploying multiple control plane machines with cluster cuddle directly. I don't know how that workflow necessarily differs from the work that you've been doing for kind of enabling HA. So that may be another alternative. We can pull in the HA or the multiple control plane support from cluster cuddle, from cluster API, and bring that back into the AWS provider.
That work was actually done by one of our teammates, so we're happy to speak to that as much as we can if you have questions about the CAP-E HA control plane work.
Yeah, sure. If you could elaborate a bit, that would be helpful for sure.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. So essentially, all that change really does is if the specified machines YAML has multiple control plane machines in it, it kind of just takes the first one and spins it up, waits for ready, and then it instantiates the other two and has them join the cluster. And then kind of all the helpers associated with doing that were modified to accept multiple control plane instances and follow that same path. And this, a lot of that logic, I believe, is due to an upstream issue where they have to be joined serially. I know that keeps coming up in a couple of issues. I know Jason could probably speak to that best.
Yeah, currently kubeadm doesn't do any locking around the handling of the kubeadm config map. We've recently seen some traction on that issue, and there's a proposed PR out there that would target kubeadm for 1.15. But because it's new functionality, I think the chances of it being backported to earlier versions of kubeadm are probably unlikely. So we would probably need to continue to do it serially until at least the lowest version that we support in Cluster API would be 1.15.
Okay, so just to summarize on my side, so if I use apply machine phase from copy, would that include the change you guys made, or it's made somewhere else? Because what I do in my code is I basically just call apply machine phase from copy, and that basically waits, and then I wait for the first control plane node to appear, and then I create two others serially as well.
Yeah, so if we were to consume that, what we would probably want to do is get that multi-control plane support for Cluster API merged into the release 0.1 branch for Cluster API, and then we could update our vendor reference to track the release 0.1 branch. So that wouldn't necessarily require a full release of Cluster API to consume it. And it would also ensure that we're tracking a branch that isn't going to potentially include breaking changes as Cluster API starts working on V1 Alpha 2.
Cool, that makes sense.
So we would just need a PR against Cluster API that would merge that change back to the release 0.1 branch. Once that merges, then we can update the vendor references in Cluster API provider AWS, and at least hopefully just validate that it works.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I will work on getting that, and then I will progress with the work I'm doing within Kappa.
Sounds good. All right, and moving on, we have a couple of PSAs. It looks like who added? Was this Unity or who added these?
Yeah, sorry, I should put my name against this. Yeah, so some stuff from SIG AWS last week. So I've been voluntold to do a demo of Kappa on the 3rd of May. So that's scheduled in. So and also is more thinking about probably V1 Alpha 2 and later is there's been talk from AWS and others around how to handle spot pricing and sort of advanced AWS scaling functionality, and not putting this all into the cluster autoscaler code. So this is going to probably have to find a home at some point, and it's been mooted whether or not that will eventually end up in Cluster API. So it's just something to be aware of. Haven't really got any deep thoughts on it right now.
Yeah, and I think this touches on another topic, and this is probably a little out of scope for this meeting, and we'll probably want to bring this up, at least a cluster autoscaler talk on Wednesday's meeting. But in general, we're already dealing with issues as we talk about the cluster API and autoscaler integration, to where there's behavior that's being done strictly in the autoscaler that we probably want to also be able to take advantage of as well, within cluster API as well. Things like which specific nodes to target when scaling down operations and things like that. It seems a little odd to have completely distinct and different behavior for that when the cluster autoscaler is involved versus manual scaling operations, because I would assume we would want to take into account all of the kind of scheduling knowledge that the cluster autoscaler has when doing manual scaling operations as well. And if we're talking about like being able to add support for leveraging spot instances for scale up operations, that's probably also something that would make sense in the manual scaling use case as well. So even if it's, I don't necessarily know that cluster API should own it, but maybe it should live somewhere so that it can be imported as a library to be used in both places, or we should determine some way to be able to share that and not have kind of distinct behaviors depending on whether or not the autoscaler is used.
Yeah, it makes sense. The shared library option also came up as well. Yeah. So.
All right. Does anybody else have any other topics? Nope. All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.